Hard hit by a sharp fall in international passenger demand, airline companies are coming up with a variety of cost-cutting measures. But what would really make the airline industry take off again, and how long would that take? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. The airline industry prepares for a bumpy, turbulent ride. With fewer passengers and rising fuel costs, many airlines are reporting huge losses and revenue reductions. The latest to join the growing list is Australia's biggest airline, Qantas, suffering its first loss and experiencing the biggest drop in passenger numbers in 6 years. The plunge in demand is attributed to the global recession that started late last year. In addition, the spread of swine flu has resulted in even fewer travellers. Struggling to reduce losses, Qantas has now embarked on a major cost-cutting programme, quite like Singapore Airlines, which is expected to post its first loss in years. While the economic outlook, passenger demand, fuel prices and exchange rates continue to be volatile and hard to predict. Airlines are looking into costs, the key variable that they can control. Up to a third of a carrier's operating costs is attributed to the price of jet fuel. Hence, airlines are looking into deploying fuel-efficient aircraft. And to avoid wasting fuel by flying half-empty planes, some airlines are flying fewer or smaller jets. To conserve fuel, carriers are also looking into ingenious initiatives to make the aircraft lighter, like reducing the size of spoons and dropping in-flight magazines. Other measures include managing flight schedules efficiently and streamlining check-in procedures. Well, joining me for this edition of Inside Story in Geneva, Brian Pearce, he's Chief Economist at the International Air Transport Association, IATA. In Minneapolis, Seth Kaplan, owner and Chief Analyst at Airline Weekly. And in Manchester, in the UK, David Bentley, partner at the Big Pond Aviation. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Brian Pearce, can I come to you first in Geneva? Just give us a perspective, really, of the airline industry globally. How bad is the situation?
Well, I think it's the toughest situation the industry has faced in the post-war years. Cash is being burnt up by companies as they're having to attract passengers onto planes by cutting fares and cargo rates very substantially, and at the same time they're being squeezed by rising fuel costs. We're expecting to see very substantial losses continuing this year, and we already saw the industry lose over $3 billion in the first quarter.
Well, of course, that's perhaps the global perspective. I mean, how does that affect you, Seth, in North America? How are airlines coping with those rising fuel costs and falling passenger numbers? Has it affected the airline industry?
Well, the story here is that for the first time in several years, the North American airlines, and especially the U.S. airlines, are actually better off than many of the other carriers around the globe. A year ago, when fuel was at those record levels, the U.S. airlines suffered most because the dollar at the time, and of course fuel is purchased in U.S. dollars, the dollar was also weak. This time it's a bit different. Whereas some of the other carriers around the world are having some of their worst years in memory, the U.S. carriers are doing a bit better. That's because the dollar has strengthened, allowing them to experience the full benefit of those falling fuel prices, and also because they're just exposed to different parts of the business that in many cases aren't doing as poorly. Airlines that are very exposed to premium long-haul demand, especially exposed to cargo, those are airlines that are having a rougher time of it. The U.S. airlines, even the global ones, just aren't as exposed to those markets. Now, within that, the low-cost carriers, the budget carriers, as is happening around the world, are doing better than what we call the legacy carriers, those global carriers. In fact, most of the budget carriers actually reported operating profits during the second quarter of this year, whereas most of the legacy carriers, with the exception of Delta, by many measures the largest carrier in the world, did experience losses.
Well, we're looking at those budget carriers a little bit later in the programme. But moving over back to Europe and to Manchester in northern England, where David Bentley is, of course, as Seth calls them legacy carriers, we'd call them perhaps the state-owned carriers. Some of them, like British Airways, for example, their chief executive saying that they're in a fight for survival. How are the European carriers, David, dealing with this particular global recession, and how are they coping with it?
They're not dealing with it very, very well, actually. the legacy carriers are certainly struggling here. You mentioned British Airways. British Airways is an example of an airline which has got very serious financial problems at the moment. It's lost £400 million last year. It's already lost £150 million in this quarter. Actually, you could say it's almost going by courtesy of a financial bond and bank guarantees that were given of £600 million within the last month or so. So certainly we have a very serious problem here. And you know, there's an old saying that what happens in the United States will happen in Europe a year later or so, and that's what we're seeing. We're also seeing Air France experiencing problems, and Lufthansa, both airlines which are seeking to consolidate and merge with other airlines as far as possible to reduce their risk. But as Seth says, in the US, we're also seeing the low-cost carriers, the budget airlines, doing quite well. I didn't think this would happen. We're used to airline passengers down trading from business to economy in a recession, but this time we're seeing them with so much more choice than they've had in previous recessions, actually taking their business to the low-cost airlines, even if they're operating from an airport far away from where they actually live.
Brian Pearce back in Geneva, if I can bring you in here. I mean, we're using IATA as our benchmark, as the authority. I mean, you're saying that in 2010 we'll see another 3% fall in air traffic. Will we also see more mergers and perhaps even the demise of some of the more established airlines across the globe? Or is this just going to affect certain regions of the globe, certain airlines?
I think the major difference with the experience that we've had in the last year is that it's spread across the globe. Usually in recessions there are some parts of the world that diversified airlines are able to concentrate their operations on, but this time, you know, everywhere in the world has been weak. And I think that means that most airlines are going to be under pressure. You know, we've seen not just a tremendous fall in passengers, you know, at the front of the aircraft with premium paying passengers. In June, numbers were still down over 21%. But even, you know, with economy passengers overall, you know, the numbers are down 7%. You know, this is an extremely deep recession spread across the globe. And yields and fares have fallen even more. So revenues are down, you know, 25%. You know, that's an extraordinary dislocation which most businesses find extremely difficult to cope with. And with rising fuel costs, cash is being used up very rapidly, which is why you're seeing many airlines going to the market to raise new capital on equity or debt. It's a matter of survival, and if the recovery is delayed or very weak, then we could certainly see some casualties over the next 12 months.
Seth Kaplan, I mean, you've been watching the industry obviously very carefully for a number of years. There is a difference, isn't there, in the way that North American airlines and European airlines do their business in comparison to the Asian airlines, and perhaps some analysts are looking to the East to see how they're coping, because they seem to be coping just slightly better than many European carriers, for example.
Right, and it's always important to distinguish between the things that an airline can control and things that are beyond its control. You know, you mentioned, of course, fuel prices as being one obviously uncontrollable cost, at least at the moment. You know, hedging could have taken place in the past, but that's a moot point once those spot fuel prices are being paid. Well, something else that varies by region are geographical differences. Southeast Asia, for example, tends to be a very good place historically to run an airline. There are geographical reasons for that. Labor costs there are also relatively low. So certainly U.S. airlines can look to some other airlines around the world that are very successful and make some adjustments based on what they see. But there are certain things like labor costs, like the currency movements that last year were a bad thing for U.S. airlines, that they can't control at the moment. You know, right now they look around the world and they see that carriers that are particularly exposed to long-haul travel, as I mentioned, premium travel, are suffering. Those that are competing more on cost, that means both low fares and low operating costs, are doing relatively well. And so, of course, airlines are trying to do more of the things that are working.
But isn't it
the other thing that U.S. carriers have done?
Sorry, Seth, I was also just going to interrupt and say, isn't it also a case that governments in Southeast Asia are more prepared to support their state airlines and airlines in general, whereas there are quite a few restrictions both in North America and certainly in Europe when the EU has very strict regulation about government bailouts for airline companies?
No question about that. There are different attitudes around the world. In a place like Southeast Asia, Singapore Airlines, while certainly a profitable company in its own right and by no means some kind of subsidized government Goliath, it is considered a priority and really an intricate part of the overall economy there. The same very much true, obviously, for the Gulf carriers like Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airlines. That the attitude is no doubt different in the U.S. and Europe, where airlines are in many cases, not only are they not helped, but many of them would say they're hindered by environmental policies and so forth. Not that they aren't as concerned about the environment as everybody else, but when you're competing in a global industry like the airline industry, and other airlines have very different operating environments, it can be hard for airlines that have not only higher labor costs, but also more restrictions, more constrained airport capacity because you can't just build a new runway as easily in places with those kinds of regulations. It is certainly harder to compete, and that's not something that the airlines in the short term anyway can necessarily control.
David Bentley, let me bring you in here about Europe. I mean, there's much discussion at the time, if we talk about the environment, about the second runway being built at Manchester, for example. I mean, how important is it now for governments to reassess how they charge airlines for using their airports? Because as Seth touched upon, the Middle East regimes and countries don't exactly charge for their airport space to their own national airlines, and they don't tax them as such. That's very different, isn't it, in Europe?
Oh yes. Look, I'll just make a comment there about the situation in Southeast Asia. I'm not entirely sure that all the airlines there are doing as well as was suggested. For example, Singapore Airlines, as in your introduction, and also Cathay Pacific. And Japan Airlines, which lost $800 million in the last quarter. These are airlines which are trading where there are financial and industrial trade complexes which have been, of course, most badly hit by the recession. And also there's far more evidence of swine flu, for example, in Japan. This is why I think Asia Pacific is experiencing a downturn, which maybe it didn't expect. But to come back to your question directed specifically at me, yes, certainly environmentalism is a very, very big issue in Britain, for example, and in Europe generally. Let me give you a specific example. The opposition to the building of a third runway at London Heathrow Airport is 86% of the local population. Now, that's not just the people who are living around the airport. That's within Greater London and the southeast area of England, a population of 15 million people. That's the sort of difficulties that the aviation industry has to face up to now in Europe, and it's one of the reasons why I'm not entirely sure that there will be a recovery from this recession to the degree that we thought. I think there's such a very, very strong environmental, ecologically friendly lobby now that the airlines have got a lot of work to do in the forthcoming Copenhagen summit to convince the world that they have a viable product which is in line with the way people think these days. So yes, certainly I think a lot of that is coming out of the UK, very much so at this moment.
And of course, as you talk about that upcoming conference in Copenhagen, Brian Pearce back in Geneva, of course, an airline wants to face all the problems that it has and does to be competitive and provide an excellent service, both for its passengers and for its reputation. But to upgrade their aircraft and to keep the environment clean, that costs money. And if at the present moment they don't have that money, they're having to start cancelling the planes that they've ordered, and they don't really want to start mothballing the planes that they're still paying for. So it's a real problem for many airlines.
It is, but before I address that, I think I must correct what might be a misconception your viewers are picking up. I mean, you're talking about state-owned airlines. The airline sector is highly liberalised, particularly in Europe where markets are completely open. You don't get government ownership of airlines anymore, and that's certainly the case in North America and increasingly parts of Europe. It's a highly competitive industry.
That may be in Europe, and sorry, sir, that may be in North America and in Europe, but certainly in Southeast Asia, a lot of the airlines are still state-owned, though, aren't they?
Yes, that's true, but certainly Singapore Airlines' success is more due to the quality of its product and the strength of its balance sheet than any intervention from government.
So, with regards to how airlines are going to cope now with dealing with issues like the environment and yet having to consider new aircraft that will actually maintain their business and keep them at a level so that customers keep coming back to them. What is the solution now? Many of these long-haul airlines or airlines that have been well established have got a problem on their hands, have they not, with competition from low-cost carriers?
Well, I mean, we've got low-cost carriers on some of the domestic routes, but I mean, it's a highly competitive industry on long-haul markets anyway. And many of the, I think this distinction is an incorrect one. Many of the established airlines, as you call them, have got low-cost carriers that they own, which are subsidiaries of them operating on certain routes. There's been a lot of innovation in the industry, and those distinctions, I think, are wrong nowadays. But there is a big issue about how the industry is going to afford the replacement of its fleet, given the environmental pressures that are on the industry, and also, given the pressure to reduce costs. But I think it's what we have seen so far this year is that airlines have continued to take delivery of roughly 100 new aircraft a month while retiring a lot of the older aircraft. That's meaning fuel efficiency gains of perhaps 20, 30, sometimes even 40%, which is both saving costs for the industry, which they need to do at the moment, but also good for the environment too.
Seth, is that a debate that's hot in North America, the whole case of the environment? And then, of course, we've seen a great deal of mergers within the American airline industry in the past couple of years.
Absolutely. I would say North America is somewhere in environmental issues between Europe and the rest of the world. These issues are generally most at the forefront in Europe, very much so though in North America as well, and then in other parts of the world they're not quite at the top of everybody's minds to the same degree, but that's changing all the time. In terms of capacity, another reason on top of the ones that we mentioned earlier why the US carriers in particular are doing relatively well, not celebrating their results, but relatively well compared to the rest of the world, is that they began cutting capacity sooner. Now, they did that in response to a very different crisis, the one last year, the fuel prices, but fair enough, now they're in a situation where because of that and because of their existential issues, or so they thought last year, they've taken a lot of capacity out of the sky, far more so than most carriers around the world rather, and so they're in a situation where they have more appropriately matched capacity to current demand. Going forward, they don't have the kinds of aircraft orders that some of the carriers around the world, certainly the Gulf carriers and others as well, have. And in fact, there are airlines, United Airlines would be most prominent among them, that really still have to think about what they're going to do going forward because they don't have significant aircraft on order. And you get to a point where you do need to replace your aircraft. You're not just ordering new aircraft for growth, but you have older aircraft that just become less efficient to operate. So at a moment like this, the reduced capacity is certainly a good thing. Capacity discipline, the airlines would call it. In terms of mergers, well, Delta purchased Northwest Airlines just recently, making Delta, as I mentioned earlier, by most measures, the biggest airline in the world. And some of the other CEOs of the large North American airlines make no bones about the fact that they are in favor of consolidation. A lot of times, though, what happens is that consolidation might be good for the overall industry, but who is in the position to go ahead and buy an airline, take the expense of not only acquiring that airline, but then integrating it? Sometimes you might be doing your competitors a favor because you've taken that competition out of the market, but you're the one that has to actually digest that airline. And so I think it's a matter of seeing who's willing to go first in that regard.
Well, David Bentley in Manchester, you were nodding in agreement with much of what Seth had to say. And if we talk about consolidation, Lufthansa have just bought out BMI, haven't they? But quite reluctantly.
Well, Lufthansa are pretty well trying to buy the world at the moment, by the looks of it. Yes, we're certainly catching up the US in terms of capacity cuts, but also catching up in terms of consolidation. I think the US has probably consolidated as much as it can do now. I don't know where any more economies can come from there. But there's a lot of spare fat left in the European business, and Lufthansa seems to be trying to buy that up. I think it's been involved with, I think it's 8 or 9 airlines over the last 3 or 4 years, which it's either bought, tried to buy, or is in the business of trying to buy. And it's becoming a very, very powerful airline. There's been speculation for many years now that Europe would end up with just 3 or 4 major airlines, and I think finally that's coming to fruition. And what they're likely to be is the enormous Lufthansa, which incidentally owns about 20% of JetBlue in the US as well, Air France KLM, which of course has taken over the remnants of Alitalia, but it's walked away today from a deal with Czech Airlines. British Airways, if it survives, and part of its survival policy inevitably will be trying to do a deal with American and Iberia, which are both fraught deals subject to all sorts of regulations and different views of the various parties. The fourth airline likely to survive and prosper will probably be Ryanair, which I think Ryanair is going to change in the future from the low-cost airline beast it's been for the last 15 years, and which we all know and love, into something possibly slightly different. And that will start to happen if and when it goes long haul.
Well, of course, all these questions still perhaps reflect and affect the global business. Brian Pearce, if we sort of widen this out now and look further to solutions to try and consolidating the particular situation. With the economists around the world, they keep looking to the east, looking to China for a solution. Is that the way the airline industry should be looking as well, considering, well, as we've just mentioned, Japan has a real problem economically in its own country. Are China, Japan, India, any of those nations possibly a solution to the problem?
Well, it's certainly true that we're starting to see an economic recovery there in the second quarter in China, Korea, Japan, ahead of other economies. But I think the airline industry is different from the manufacturing industry. We can't relocate our factory to China and run successful businesses from there. People still want to travel from New York to London. So no, I think it's not the case that the answer necessarily lies east in terms of the business model. I think the industry has been very innovative, and I think the pressures that it's under will lead to further innovation. David mentioned that even the new entrants like Ryanair and others, and we're seeing this in the US as well, they're changing from a point-to-point model to taking more connecting passengers as a lot of these routes are used up. And the established airlines, we've seen them radically change their business models in terms of serving customer segments or in terms of running a different sort of model depending on the type of route, with Qantas running its low-cost subsidiary in Australia. I think you're going to see more of that. But until we see regulatory change to allow cross-border mergers or to allow American airlines to operate with airlines in China in a sensible way, until we see those regulatory changes, it's very difficult to see the industry changing dramatically without that taking place.
We'll have to keep a very close eye on it as a whole across the globe. Unfortunately, we've run out of time there, gentlemen, but I'd like to thank you all for joining me on Inside Story. Brian Pearce there in Geneva, Seth Kaplan in Minneapolis, and David Bentley in Manchester, UK. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions, so please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks for your time and your company.